Hello and welcome everyone back to another episode of the Publisher Lab. I'm Tyler Bishop, and very special guest today, someone that, to be honest, I'm excited just to trap in the room to talk about all things digital publishing because one of the people that I've learned the most from, and actually one of the people that you know I still think gets the best insights and has sort of like the best outlook on our space, Dwayne Lafleur. Dwayne, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for finally inviting me.
CEO of Ezoic. And obviously, that's where you and I have been working together for a long time. And yeah, the offer to join the show is always here. I'm sure that the audience would love it. But glad to trap you here towards the end of the year finally.
Yeah, happy to be here.
And I think, I mentioned last week on the podcast that one of my least favorite things is like the weeks like over the holidays where you start getting all your podcasts or shows and everybody's on break, so you get those best of episodes. So we actually decided we were going to do it differently. We saved our best content for those few weeks. So
yeah, we'll see
how it works out. I think this is something that we wanted to do for a minute, and since it's the end of the year, I thought we could basically go through some of the overarching topics or themes that I think sort of have been a vibration underneath all the other stories and things like that in digital publishing. And we've got some, as always, topical stuff from this week, past couple weeks, that we can kind of like point to as maybe the most recent iteration of some of those things. How's that sound?
Sounds great.
Before we get started, maybe I could give a background on sort of your experience in this space, but like maybe just a little bit of a background on you, Ezoic, just sort of how you got here.
Yeah, sure. So I've been in online advertising since the mid 2000s. Originally, my last company was a company called Cubics, which was the first ad company on Facebook. So back in the mid 2000s, Facebook opened up the platform to third-party application developers, essentially publishers. Most of the publishing there was games. There's a lot of content, quizzes, that type of thing. That Cubics was the company that provided advertising for those developers. And that was before Facebook even had ads on the platform. So lived through that.
Before Facebook had any ads?
Right. It was the only ads on Facebook.
I remember those days.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was a lot of fun. There was a lot of data there, and obviously massive volume. Lived through the downturn of 2007, 2008 in that business, and then that really transitioned into virtual currency, which now you see on mobile. And I left that company.
Real virtual currency, the kind that you use in a game, right?
Yeah, Farmville bucks, that kind of stuff. Yeah, not crypto. No, we weren't quite there yet. And then that company was acquired, and spent a couple more years in the space, and then started Ezoic a little more than 10 years ago now. So the concept behind Ezoic, we really purchased a bunch of web properties, became publishers ourselves, and built out what we wanted from a monetization and user experience perspective to balance the two. So,
and I think one of the things that's interesting about sort of like, you think about the days of Facebook before ads, and then you think about today. The thing that I think is maybe, I think a lot of attention gets put on sort of the platform changes over that course of time. But, those platform changes, either they mirror or they sort of reflect, I guess, pretty massive changes in content too, digital content at least. Mm-hmm. And you definitely saw the advertising ecosystem move from digital advertising being something that was a nice to have to being the majority of. I guess like what sticks out to you the most in terms of, I guess if you think about like the last 15 years of content and how it's evolved digitally, like, is there anything that sticks out to you as being something you were like, that is this biggest stark contrast I can draw between then and now?
I actually don't think it's that complicated. I think the ad money follows the eyeballs. So the transitions are entirely driven by users, not by advertisers, not by publishers even really. So back in the early days of Facebook, we were talking to ad agencies and they were going, oh, we need to try this social thing. We hear it's a big deal. And, you know, that, and we used to have this chart about time spent on each medium and then the dollars spent on each medium. And there was always a massive disparity. And we still haven't even leveled out digital versus non-digital. The amount of money spent on radio and newspapers even is still way above. So we're just seeing that happen again now within digital. Mobile hasn't caught up quite to usage yet. And video hasn't caught up to time spent as well. So it's just kind of transitioning along as people switch what they do. And it takes a long time. It takes 10 years probably.
Yeah, we had John Cole on a couple weeks ago, and one of the things that I think he's pointed out before is just, tech moves really fast from a innovation standpoint, and a lot of times, even as publishers, you're pretty plugged into changes that affect you and your business, but user behavior, like the total bell curve of user behavior, often is a pretty slow moving sort of chain of events. So. I guess what does that lag look like? It's easy to kind of look back in retrospect and be like, oh, that kind of happened really quickly. But, are we talking, years? Are we talking a year longer?
Yeah. A decade, probably. Yeah. Yeah. I think people focus on, all the kids are using TikTok or anything like that. But I don't know about you, but if you called your mom, and
on TikTok
and asked her what she thinks of ChatGPT, or I think you might get a blank stare. Maybe not your mom. Maybe you've talked to her about it. Probably.
Yeah, my mom listens to the podcast, believe it or not, and it makes shout out to Mom. But she says she listens to it because she wants to hear my voice, which I don't know. She says that because I think she thinks I'll be excited about it, but it actually makes me kind of sad. So I'm glad you listen, though, Mom.
Hi.
But I do think that, I think you're right about that. I think that, the reference point that I think the average person has for a lot of the things that we talk about on the show, they've either never heard of it or they're just have a cursory awareness to some degree. I use my wife, for example. She's not a layman by any stretch. She uses technology every day. But, I asked her a couple weeks ago, because I mentioned it on the podcast, how often have you used ChatGPT? I was aware of one time, and she's told me she's used it 2 or 3, maybe.
There you go.
So it's not quite there yet. But that kind of leads us into our first topic, which is the rise of generative AI. So I think if there's a banner sort of like topic for this year in publishing, it's probably the impact of AI. And this I want to get into like maybe a little bit more of a meta version, or I guess dive down a little bit deeper into the topic, because I think it's sort of where it started with, which is ChatGPT, a chatbot, right? I don't know that, you might correct me, you know more about sort of the AI environment, but was it expected that a chatbot would be the first sort of like big bang of AI that we got exposed to as, I guess, a human race? I don't know. This is the first time that, AI has really been available in mass to people. So, was a chatbot what we expected?
Well, I think AI has been everywhere, so it's the only version that we can see and interact with more than anything. I guess that and like voice assistants. So ultimately, asking a question and getting an answer is what we see, but AI has been driving things behind the scenes for a long time. So, whether it's self-driving cars or, the settings on a smart TV, like all of that is driven by those types of things. It's just not as visible to us. So, I think it's the natural evolution. Ultimately, search, you go there, ask a question, looking for an answer, and search is inefficient. You are provided with a long list of text. You click. You have to go, the first one doesn't give you the right answer. You have to go back. You have to click on the next one. You have to refine your search. So a chatbot is a much more efficient form of search.
And, I think it's kind of interesting because we've had you've had Apple, you've had Google, Amazon, you name it. Every big tech platform has had their sort of their Siri or Alexa, these voice activated sort of like, this is what we imagined in the Jetsons, right? Like you say something out loud and then it's like, yes, sir, Mr. Jetson, calling your wife now or whatever. But those things have always kind of been, I think I guess the rise of these things being everywhere and, being central to our lives, that's something that has been talked about for a decade, but it never felt like it really got here. And I would argue, and probably most of our audience would say that because they weren't really that good or that useful, search has always been useful. And I think, the revelation with ChatGPT is that it's good enough. Is that the thing that we've been waiting for? Something to interact with that's actually good enough to provide, answers to questions. Is it maybe the flexibility of these things, or is it more so, I guess, the accuracy of them that makes them useful?
Yeah, the previous versions were terrible. If you want to do anything other than check the weather or play a song, they were basically useless. So, I think the quality of it is the differentiator. And I think Amazon and others decreasing their team size to not focus on those products. They thought that was because people weren't interested in the product, when really it was just that the product wasn't good enough. So I think what we'll see with these models is they're going to replicate human communication in every form. So if you think about your interaction with another person, with your mom, since she's come up already, how do you do that, right? So sometimes you text, that's the chatbot. Sometimes you send her a picture, that's the visual input. Sometimes you send her a video, that's a visual input. Sometimes you talk to her. So these bots are just going to replicate human communication. They don't care as long as the input's coming in, and they're going to respond in kind. When it's, you're laying in bed in the middle of the night, you maybe don't want to talk to something, you want to type it. When you're alone in your car, maybe you want to talk to something. Maybe.
Yeah. I like to talk all the time.
You're probably texting. Yeah. Don't text and drive.
Don't text and drive. I do find that that idea is sort of interesting from the standpoint of, you mentioned the thing about like being able to communicate and the different types of communication. I think one of the things that stands out to me with these models is, and this has been a topic of discussion in publishing all year long, which is how much are they, basically communicating back to you versus essentially a little plagiarism machine, like being able to sort of like guess what the next word is versus being able to actually formulate sort of like what we would think of as maybe a thought or or an answer or something along those lines. And to be honest, I don't know. You might have a little bit more insight on this. How sophisticated are they versus something that's like a very magical parlor trick?
Yeah, the current version is. Do you remember the first iPhone?
Yes.
So it was like both magical and also terrible.
Yeah.
That's the version that we're at right now, and it's a starting point. And by the time we get to probably the third or fourth generation, it's going to be more magical and less terrible. But the way the models work right now is all they're doing is predicting what the next word is going to be based on all the context. So that isn't plagiarism, but it's built upon all of its inputs and thinking, what would somebody else say next?
Yeah.
Not necessarily one individual person, but what would society, like based on all of my training data, say next?
Yeah. What would an employee that had zero idea of what plagiarism is write if you told them to write something?
Right. And people do that already. You learn, whether it starts from language when you're a kid, you learn based on what other people say. You also read stuff, and then that dictates what you're probably going to say next. And if you play a game, if we're doing predict the next word, so I say hi,
Tyler.
Okay, could be Hal, because but if I said hi Hal, what's the next word?
R.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what it's doing. It's taking a lot more inputs than that and just predicting. So it's not like a super intelligent being or anything like that. However, we need to recognize the pace of progress, or how quickly it's progressing here. The version, GPT-4 that we're using is almost a year old. And clearly what they're working on internally now, there was a big controversy over, because it's getting to the point of being a little bit scary. So,
and one of the things that's been discussed in that, and is the idea that it would be able to, when you think of it in the terms that you just put, it doesn't feel like an it yet. But then you start to talk about, adding in the ability to reason, where it's not just necessarily predicting the next word based on context, but it's taking that context and then adding in sort of other information, where it's basically processing what are the chances that this person means this, and how does that relate to these 10 other things. And at that point, that's sort of how neurons operate inside of the brain. Mm-hmm. And so you got these, like, especially if it's learning, then you've got like the dendrite functions inside of a neuron. So the question then is, like, as it gets these sort of abilities to reason, how useful is an OpenAI ChatGPT versus something like, Twitter just rolled out Grok, or X, formerly known as Twitter. Their paid AI chatbot, and the big thing with it is it has all Twitter's data and information and live streaming information, which is there's clearly value there, and ChatGPT is not going to have access to it, I would guess. Mm-hmm. And so I guess looking forward in time, you mentioned the iPhone earlier. Is the iPhone, 1, which, iPhone is synonymous with mobile now. Are we going to have OpenAI, ChatGPT? Most people use ChatGPT, or, one of these other Microsoft's, Microsoft's one's called what? I wanted to say Bard, but that's Google. Copilot they've changed the name a few times. So yeah, I guess the question then becomes, is it a name brand, or is this going to be something where we just want lots of, each service is going to have its own, and you might have to pay for them all, or who knows?
Yeah. It's hard to say. I think probably the history of tech is there's usually winner takes all or winners take all. So, I mean, I think that's one way to think about it here, is that whoever ends up with the best one probably wins. But on the flip side of that, just to contradict myself, I could see a scenario where they all get to be so good for what they're doing that you don't really care. So, if the answers to your everyday questions on Android are basically as good as they are on Apple devices, basically as good as they are on, your Windows machine, whatever it is, I think they'll come in different forms, but do you really care? So yeah, it'll be interesting. I think it's really hard to predict.
That kind of pivots us into our next topic with a question that I had related to that, because, one of the things that I'd argue, the reason why Google became so successful as a search engine initially was the simplicity of it. It also was very good. But it's also maintained its dominance in part, and that's been a story we won't go into that because we've fleshed it out over months and months. But one of the reasons that's not related to any form of antitrust is the fact that Google has had a really good search engine for a very long time. But I would argue now that while I'd find DuckDuckGo and many of the privacy-based ones to be just terrible in comparison, you do have Microsoft and Bing and other search engines that are quite good, and I would say interchangeable in many respects, but yet Google is a pillar of search. Is the same thing possible with these generative AIs, do you think?
The same thing meaning one company dominates?
Yeah,
I think so. I mean, I think with Google search, they're still the best, and that's what makes them retain their dominance mostly. However, they're now a brand. You don't even really say search for that anymore. So they've completely replaced the verb that's used for the action. So I think it's really difficult to replace them, and that's partly one reason for the dominance. But I do think it's better. I've tried to switch many times myself, and you start using Bing, you're like, hey, you type in some sample queries and you're like, this is pretty good, it's giving me the same results. And then you get that 1 or 2 things per week that for me, it's like looking up some sort of coding information or technical documentation. You're like, this isn't even close.
Yeah.
And next thing you know, you're back to Google. So I think that's ultimately it. Best product probably wins.
And, I think Microsoft Bing kind of had its moment. I would say back in March or April is kind of when this peaked. But right whenever they had, first announced the deal with OpenAI and integrating it into their search engine, Google felt a little behind. You could see really quickly, like Bing usage was going up. And it was, I don't think that anybody really believed that, like, hey, this is Microsoft finally, like, they're going to make their move now on Google search. But you did see that momentum die, as sort of predictably it would. But I do think that is part of the conversation, where Microsoft definitely feels like more of a relevant party in digital publishing than they did a year ago. But I'm not sure that's really formed in reality yet. For publishers that are trying to figure out, like, how relevant is, Google? Do I need to start looking at the lifeboats around me? Is Microsoft one of them? Or, is it just Google's going to be here? Don't worry.
Yeah. I mean, I think going back to what we talked about earlier, that change is slow. I think Google's going to be here, or Google search is going to be here for the foreseeable future. But it's all driven by user behavior. So they either are going to follow that user behavior, and they ultimately have to go and win in a new space. And they do have the advantage of a brand name there. Or they're going to die a slow death like so many other technology companies.
And one of the things that you mentioned, the user behavior thing, and I think one of the things that is really fascinating when you go through the Google antitrust hearing, like documents from the court and stuff, which we've talked about on the show previously, and some of the revelations that have come out of that. The thing that is actually maybe the most impressive is that Google had really great foresight into sort of like what user behavior would look like in 10 years. You think about them getting very far ahead on things like mobile. And I think I don't know if they have the same sort of like insight now. I'm not sure if anybody does. I'll let you know in a couple years. But it does beg the question of is it hard for someone like Google? So I saw the story from this week was video mode now in search results Google is only going to show the thumbnail on the search results page for pages that contain mostly video, and that there's actually going to be a Search Console based notification for that as well. And I think it's specifically for videos marked up with video schema. But this is Google sort of adapting to something like video. And I would argue that sort of like video on a mobile phone, not the newest and latest thing. You mentioned earlier in our conversation the usage data being sort of out of sync with sort of ad dollars and different things like that. Is Google playing catch up now? And is a company like Google playing catch up ultimately going to fall into the same fate as many others in the past versus the one that's maybe looking far out into the future?
Yeah. I mean, my opinion with Google is that they have the right strategy and they have the foresight. And, at Ezoic, we work with them quite closely. I think they know what's coming. I think they're thinking about things the right way, but they're so big that their execution is poor, or slow, maybe not poor. So yeah, like what you cited, how them, with Android and mobile and becoming one of the big two players there. They bought YouTube before video was a big thing. They and on this AI race, they were also first, where they purchased DeepMind. They were hiring all the top researchers, etc. So they were thinking about it the right way. They're just not executing as well as even other big companies like Microsoft. I think are more aggressive on these places and are executing better. So. And with video mode, is it them catch up? So they maybe they rolled out that they would only show videos that were the primary content on the page in unified search a couple of years ago, I think. And then now adding that to the video tab, I think only makes sense. And when you search for a video and you click and you end up on a web page that has a video somewhere on the page, and it becomes a Where's Waldo? Like that's not what users are looking for. So I think it makes total sense. And it's something that with Humix we tackled a couple of years ago when we first rolled out the product, where it creates separate video pages that rank in that unified search. And you've seen a lot of large publishers do that as well. When you go to like a CNN, when you click on a video, it has a video only page for each video, just for the ranking purposes.
And kind of in line with that, one of the things that I think publishers are probably starting to think about now, when you think about maybe a publisher that has traditionally built a website and published largely articles online. When you have a website, what do you have? You've got whatever your framework is. WordPress is incredibly popular, and you host it someplace, right? And there's your website. It's hosted someplace. You have your domain name. Video is this incredible. I mean, YouTube is the third largest search engine. I don't know if you knew this or not.
Mm-hmm.
The second is actually, surprise, it's also Google. It's images and video. So video is very popular, 2 and 3 in terms of search engines. And where would you say the majority of that content is hosted? It's not on individual publisher domains, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's ultimately on YouTube. And I think the thing that a lot of the publishers that we work with miss is that that's not a requirement. I think there's a misconception that Google is ranking YouTube content higher. And we've seen time and time again that that's not the case. So my opinion is when you're posting your content only on YouTube, like I think you have to have your content on YouTube right now, but when you're posting it only there, you're giving away your audience and some of your authority. And we've seen it with some prominent names that get banned from there, or they make the rules. And you're just giving all of that away to a third party when you could be hosting that on your own domain, still getting visitors to your page. You control what the recommended is that's beside your video. You try to drive them to other content on your channel or on your site. There's a lot of things that you can do with having that visitor come to your site as opposed to going to YouTube. I think that hopefully will be a trend here in the coming years, is that people realize, you know what, I actually want to keep my audience and not have it on a third party platform.
And I think the strange thing with the video is that because YouTube has been an incumbent for so long, I think, it gets treated a lot differently than other things. But, you think about, hosting all your video inside of YouTube. I mean, most of the publishers that do use WordPress listening to the show, you wouldn't host the majority of their content on a WordPress.com. They'd want to use the CMS framework. But even more so than that, looking back at history, you remember Facebook pages?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Facebook pages was, you don't even need a website anymore. You're getting so much traffic from Facebook. There was a time whenever you could get 1 million followers on Facebook, and that meant you could have a lot of traffic. You could drive traffic back to your site. And then Facebook was like, hey, you don't even need that website. They're already here.
Yeah.
Send them right to your
Just give it to us. We'll take care of it.
Yeah. And, that Facebook pages isn't here anymore, and for a pretty good reason. Yeah. And I think that publishers are very weary of those types of things. But because YouTube kind of feels like it's always been here, it sort of sneaks past those things.
Yeah, I think it's the perfect analogy. If Google came out with something that said, hey, don't post your next article on your website, just post it on google.com and we'll split the ad revenue 50-50 with you, publishers would pull out the pitchforks. Yet when you have a discussion about video, it's like, oh, I just put it up there and it'll be fine. So it's interesting. And hopefully it'll change.
And so, speaking of that topic, you mentioned the revenue sharing, and it's an inevitable part of sort of like this business with a platform. So, as a publisher, obviously you need someone like Google But you always try to figure out how much do I have to feed the beast without letting it eat me. And those choices are fairly limited, right? Like, you'd like to think that you can find that balance, but that balance is not come towards publishers, I would say. But I would say historically it hasn't either. And one of the things that whether it's the judicial processes and things like that across all the different municipalities, states, countries, and things like that, as it relates to the platforms at large, you still have this large advertising ecosystem that is pushing back against sort of the platforms, which now dictate largely a lot of advertising, because digital being the primary source of advertising, or the largest, I guess, portion of that pie. But the question then becomes, like we talked about chatbots earlier, we talked about some of these other technologies, things like Grok. If people start to change the way they consume content or expect different forms, we were talking about video, how well is Google's Trajectory, something we were just talking about, positioned to align with those user behaviors in the future, but then also sort of advertising. Are these things all on the same trajectory now? Are they forking? And is the power shifting in any particular direction? And I guess, like, what would shift that power, either towards or away from publishers?
Yeah. So I mean, it's pretty hard to predict, I guess
Yeah.
where it's going to go. Yeah, I would say the trend's been consistently against or away from publishers for a long time. There's obviously a lot of companies that are trying to shift that back, and there's a little bit more of a fight, or there has been for the last 5 years or 10 years. But ultimately, the sources of traffic to publishers control the industry. So I think they have the most data. They ultimately are the biggest ad players, whether it's Google for display ads or Facebook for video. It's because they control the audience overall. So,
and one of the things that we've constantly seen, and it's a story that pops up every probably 3 to 4 months on here, and I always tell our good friend producer Manny here, oh, it's about that time again. Advertisers are upset about ads being placed next to extremist content, or something along those lines. They're being paid, doing an experiment and learning they're paid 30 cents on the dollar for a display ad or something like that somebody ran on their own site. And these things all end up being, when you get enough publishers kind of upset at the same time, it's really sort of just like a chance to maybe negotiate a tiny bit, usually with one of the platforms, or get them to do some kind of PR movement that in many cases is very unhelpful, or et cetera. And the same thing could be said for regulations and things like that we've seen implemented and things like that across GDPR, CCPA, but you are seeing now Google's starting to do things like, I saw this week, Google's going to share limited search partner site placement info with advertisers. So this is basically Google offering limited information on certain ad placements across its search partner network in response to the Analytics report, which kind of highlighted a little bit about constant problem in advertising, knowing exactly where your ad spend is going. Is this just one of do we expect things to shift in terms of what kind of transparency, what sort of the way that business has been done in both programmatic and just general digital advertising over the last decade? Is this space ever going to get cleaned up? I'm very cynical on this topic, as is anybody that works in the space, I've found. And I think it's for a good reason. It's because these things sort of have a very top level surface sort of like discussion, that underneath the surface, nothing is changing. Do you think that continues, or is that something that like you're optimistic about?
I mean, I think I'm actually a little bit optimistic. The changes around, with sellers JSON and ads on text, I think have provided a little bit more transparency. But if you just back away from all the technicalities of it, I think hopefully everybody can agree that when an advertiser is buying an ad, they should be able to know where that ad was, and like have some insight into that. I think if you think about any other advertising medium, if you're buying a billboard, you're like, oh, it's here, and we think there's this many cars that go by it, and yes, they're real cars, and so I think the basics of trying to clean up and be more transparent just makes sense for everyone, except for the bad actors. So I think over time they'll try to figure it out. I think a common misconception with the space is that there's so many parties, and that are doing different things. I think they exist because they mostly add value, and people like to think like, oh, we don't need that. But if you're an advertiser and you're trying to reach a specific target audience, you might not have the data or the data layer to apply to the general web to be able to reach that audience. And company X might have that data available, and they charge a fee for it. So there's a lot of companies that are adding value, and that's really why they exist. I don't think there's too many major players out there that are existing and growing because they're not adding value. So
yeah, there was kind of a come to Jesus moment a couple, and might be longer than a couple years ago now, where a lot of those businesses sort of kind of got filtered out of the space a little bit more. So I do think that there's been that cleanup, and yet that perception still persists. I do wonder a little bit about sort of what that ecosystem looks like with a stronger or a weaker Google. Do you think it looks a lot different in both instances, or is it maybe just different, not necessarily better or worse?
Yeah, probably just different. I think Google will say the right things, but then they obviously have to protect their current position. So, case in point here is in Google Ad Manager, there's advertiser disclosures so that publishers can see which advertisers run on their site. That's an opt-in. So if you're tied into the exchange, you can opt in. Do you want to share which advertiser purchased the inventory or not? So most parties opt in, and that information is available. One notable party opts out of sharing advertiser information, and that's Google. And that's a really good example of like they're hey, we're going to build the infrastructure so that it's transparent and visible, yet we're not going to share that information because I suppose they're scared somebody will steal their advertiser list. I don't know what it is, but it's a good example of like probably two parts of the company not communicating and not being on the same page.
Yeah, and I do think that that's something that our audience is fairly aware of, that as it relates to just about every interaction with Google. It's a love-hate relationship in many ways, because you depend on them for many things, and oftentimes things are not always executed the way that they're sort of promoted.
Right. Bidding's the same. Header bidders and third parties provide a transparent bid for inventory, and you can use whatever ad server you want. Google has no method to receive what they're actually bidding on inventory.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I think that, advertising is something that is probably, in many respects, one of the publishers' least concerns heading into 2024, in terms of, I don't think that there's an expectation that digital advertising or that ecosystem is going to change a lot in the near term. But one of the things that I would say, maybe I'm wrong about this, I've said it a couple of times, and my perception, at least from publishers, is that they felt the same way, which is in January, there was a little bit of apprehension and fear about what does generative AI, and things like that mean for the space. What is the existential threat of, and in January, it wasn't even doing this near as good as it can now, but producing content. And to what degree, are we going to live in a robot world where robots write all the content and then maybe read for us? That you think about sort of like the sky is falling scenarios that many could have imagined in January, versus I would say like the much more milder sort of like, okay, now that we've had a chance to see even the full capabilities so far of some of these things, maybe it's not the sky is falling. Where do you think we land now? And then, you know, is there a reason for apprehension? Is there a reason for optimism? You know, looking at sort of, the best we can looking into the future.
Yeah, so I think there's two sides, both of which are scary. So one is, do chatbots or whatever that morphs into replace search? And then there's the side of AI producing content. So I think it's kind of scary on both sides. I think, again, the change on both of those fronts will be slow, and that, most people are not replacing their search activity with chatbots today. But I do think that will be like the transition to phones or the internet, where over the next several years, it's going to be 1% of people in 2024. It's going to be 5% of people in 2025. It's going to be 20% of people in 2026, or whatever that's going to look like. And so that's going to constantly eat away at search traffic. And again, that's just because it's better. It's better at it. It's more efficient. It can learn about you over time.
It writes better for me if it knows what I want to write. I found that when I dictate things to ChatGPT, that it writes. If I have a core competency, I used to always tell people it's writing. I feel like I'm good at it. And if I dictate exactly what I want to write, like voice into one of the things, it'll write an article that I think is better than the one that I would have wrote, because it makes my economy of words better. It edits it. And I wonder a little bit about, that's it, getting the completeness of my thoughts and ideas, which I don't really feel negatively about that, because I'm actually, like, it made me the core thing that I want to do is not write, it's to produce content. So I'm okay with that. It's the part that I guess gives me apprehension is the idea that it wouldn't need me fully for that. But it does seem like we are quite a bit away from that. I mean, I think the last story we have for today is about ChatGPT getting worse. So, it does kind of feel like maybe I'm going to be needed for a while.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like all tech transitions, where tools start out being helpful and useful in making things more efficient, and then get more and more automation comes in later on. But it also creates a lot of opportunities that we're not thinking about. So, as far as the quality of the content that it produces, I think it's as good as the input, but there's also changes that are coming to that. One of the things that our radio team is working on right now is building out virtual writers and personas, and training AI models on that writer, or whether real or not, historically. So that'll include, like, here's my life, background, a little bit of a bio. Here's a bunch of my writing samples from the past. Here's topics that and kind of building a persona from which the AI can like draw inferences. So I think
strong opinions on whether or not birds are real.
Yeah, things like that. So I think that will get, the quality of the output from that is much, much better than using kind of a vanilla GPT. And with custom GPTs, you can train them to kind of like mimic real people. So yeah, I think again, we're at the first iPhone stage, and what it looks like in a couple of years is going to be miles ahead of where it is now. I know Sam Altman thinks that if he got enough money, they'd have general intelligence in 2024. So I think that could be a pretty big paradigm shift as well. So
yeah, I think one of the things that the question mark for that, and the impact of something like that, kind of comes back to the thing you mentioned earlier, which is like, the capabilities versus the inputs, where I think, probably 6 months ago, I was really disappointed with anything that I saw that basically turned a static image into a video, or animated something like that. It was just very, you're like, I'm not using this. Like, it's a nice trick, but
Mhm.
it's not usable. Yesterday, I looked at 3 or 4 different things that I was like, wow, that's incredible.
Mhm.
So the capabilities seem to be almost as good as you could ever imagine, seem to be on the table in terms of what's possible. But the question mark really is, the inputs. Right now, the inputs need to continue to be about the same as they were earlier this year, maybe slightly worse, but like you have more sort of like guidance on it. And I don't know if that'll shift, but generative, or I guess general intelligence potentially would shift that.
Yeah, I think so. But I think I think it isn't going to replace, like writing, for example. I don't think it's going to completely replace human writing anytime soon. But I think it's a tool that there's going to be two camps, and one camp's going to say, no, I'm not using that. I'm going to keep doing it the old way. And there's going to be a group that says, this is how I become more efficient.
Yeah.
And just with something like article writing, it's a lot easier to start with either the points or the outline, or even a completed article that you're editing, than to start from scratch. And that you can probably increase your output by 3, 4, 5 times and still have the same level of quality that you had before. And I think that's how it's going to progress, is people are going to figure out how to use it in ways like that, or updating content. If you're a large publisher and you've got 10,000 articles and helpful content update comes out and they want fresh updates, how do you tackle that? How do you update 10,000 articles? Things like that, where you can feed them in and say, hey, let's AI can figure out what we should update with. If you still want to write it yourself, like, here's the missing information, or it can actually go and provide updates to that content. So I think there's going to be an evolution of how to improve workflows for publishers over the next year or two, and obviously the capabilities are going to change. So
yeah, and I think we're talking a lot about the progress and things like that we've seen, and really you think about the beginning of the year, it's easy to sort of see things now and go, well, ChatGPT was at the start of this year and now we have all this. It's been a fast year because it was, I was impressed a couple of years ago, just the sandbox that OpenAI had, but you sort of had to very specifically, it worked almost as good as ChatGPT, but you just had to very hyper focus and set things up so that it would give you sort of the response that you were expecting it to give you. But now you've got something that's quite a bit better, but there's been a lot of discussion. I would say this is a topic that I got from you maybe 6 months ago, but it's something that's in the realm, especially in SEO right now, which is ChatGPT getting worse, ? And I think there's enough conjecture out there to assume that there's something that they've been trying to do to make, I'm guessing, scale the way that it's distributed, or this is a topic you know more about than me, but the question is, are they trying to maybe break it up into smaller models and make it smaller? And that seems to be a real trend going into 2024, is these smaller, more efficient, cost-effective models, because it takes a lot of power. Chips are super expensive and hard to find.
Yeah.
And so I think everybody's trying to figure out, like, while the hardware catches up, is there a better, technical approach? And if OpenAI's current ChatGPT is any indication of that, maybe not.
Yeah. I think these models are really expensive to train and really expensive to run. So I think they're trying to find ways to scale. And one of the ways is to make specialized models. And then I assume that that's the way that it's going to go long term. I don't think we're going to have this like monolithic model that knows everything and does everything. I think you're going to end up with layered models. So you'll have, this one is medical, and this one is about, sports. And then you ask a question about football knee injury. You want both. So I think there's going to have to be like a control layer on top of that that says, okay, wait a minute, this is about sports and medical, let's ask and combine and figure out a way to do that. I think that's probably where they're trying to go with these models. And that'll be a lot faster. And then when you can specialize a model, you can probably increase the quality of information in it as well. You can say, hey, I'm building a medical model. I'm not just going to take any random website off the internet. I'm going to like have a closed or a more vetted information source to train that model on. So you can probably increase the quality as well. So I think that's probably where it'll go. But it'll be interesting to see. And as far as the quality of GPT, there's two theories on there. One is that they're trying to do this on the behind the scenes, and that's changing the results, which might be the case. And then the other is that there's just a thing called drift in AI models, which is as people are playing around with it, it just kind of gets off path and goes. And then when they release a new one, you kind of see it come back on where you expected, and it drifts over time again. So with the next GPT-4 version that's coming out, which adds the larger context, I think you might see, oh, that got released. Oh, it's good again.
Yeah.
And then 6 weeks later, everybody's going, is it getting worse? So if we see that, then I think they probably just have a case of drift going on.
Interesting. Yeah, I could see a case for both. What you mentioned earlier about the layers, anybody that's used ChatGPT's build your own GPT function, the GPT builder, a lot of times if you prompt it, say, hey, what am I missing from this model that might make it more helpful in, X, Y, or Z, it'll list off what seems to be something similar to those layers, where it's like, you would like it to be able to parse code inputs. Mm-hmm. Would you like me to add that? Yeah, do that. Mm-hmm. It seems to have sort of like maybe those models behind the scenes or something like that.
Yeah.
And so I guess, going into 2024, what impact do you think that AI is likely to have this year or this coming year, depending on when producer Manny releases this? I think it'll still be 2023. He's nodding yes, so it will be. What types of things can we expect maybe to change or to expect from it this year or next year that we didn't have in this past year?
I don't know. Is that a good answer?
That's the best answer, actually.
I think it's really difficult to keep up with the rate of change on this, and I think that's going to be quicker in 2024 than 2023. I think you're going to see more and more developments in, just the quality of the output, the types of inputs and outputs that can happen. You'll see, probably video input go into a lot of the main models. And that's just going to cause chaos because the amount of content that's being produced right now is already completely destroying systems. So, one of my favorite examples is a WordPress plugin. So to get it approved for the store, I guess, I don't know.
Manually reviewed by someone.
It's manually reviewed by someone. Last I heard, it was like 8 months. And the reason for that is I actually posted on Twitter yesterday, somebody was asking, how can I do something on WordPress? And I just asked ChatGPT and it wrote a plugin for it.
Yeah, it can write plugins so easily.
So everybody's writing plugins and submitting them, and they're still using people to try to review them.
Yeah.
And so that's an example of just the flood of content and, in that case, code that's going to hit. And then all these other systems that have to deal with that are going to break. And that's going to include Google search, just the quantity of content that's going to be produced. And they have to index it, figure out what the highest quality stuff is and all of that. I wouldn't want to be having to solve that problem. So,
and it does speak to the I don't know aspect of it too. When you really think about the cascading effect that something has on something else, you think about the way that mobile impacted so many other things that weren't predictable in those respective spaces or companies.
Yeah.
And I'd never really thought about the WordPress manual review thing, but as soon as you brought it up, I remembered that, they still have people manually look at those. There's got to be a flood of it. So then WordPress, traditionally open source project, very, very slow moving, talking like 10-year roadmaps and stuff. So it's been aging, but aging fairly gracefully. It might be old, but it's still been effective. Something like that. Does WordPress ultimately say, hey, we need to fix our processes and change something fundamentally, which is not necessarily like their MO. But if they don't, it's not really sustainable. And then what are the large reaching ramifications of that?
Yeah, because just from an Ezoic perspective, we're making a plugin that's meant for tens of thousands of users, and we have to wait a year to get that approved. That meanwhile, somebody else just whipped something up this morning that they want to use on their own site, and they also submitted it. So how do you filter those? How do you prioritize? How do you automate that process? I don't know what they're going to do with that. In my mind, they should automate the reviews, but then that can be exploited as well, I guess. So yeah, it's just an example. And I think the example that you brought up there of the phone when it came out and how it changed everything. I don't think that when the iPhone launched, there were executives of a flashlight company sitting there going, "Oh, we're screwed." And guess what? Flashlight companies, we're in big trouble because everybody carries one around in their pocket now.
Cameras, film,
cameras,
focus.
Crazy. So I think that's where we're at, is we don't quite know.
Yeah.
Everything that it's going to affect. But yeah, there's going to be a flood of content. It's going to, all of this AI stuff is going to make the election
crazy,
a disaster. You're going to have candidates saying things in video that they didn't actually say. And it's just a little bit of chaos.
Yeah. It's that perfect timing on the cusp of something where it's like we haven't been inoculated quite yet to everything that's out there and available as a populace.
Right.
One of the things I always tell our listeners, and I think it's appropriate for how we would end the show, is I tell our listeners, like, don't worry, because by listening to the show, you're already on this end, I would say, of the spectrum of folks in your space that are plugged in, trying to stay on top of whatever is either cutting edge or just very engaged in sort of like which way things are moving and educating themselves. But outside of listening to the show, which offers, just by being a listener, that offers zero practical advice. What practical advice would you give to those listening that are publishers on how to either protect themselves or how to just approach sort of like all the things that are headed their way?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I think a lot of publishers I speak with, there's a sense of anxiety around things. The main point there is this change is happening, and you're in the middle of it, and you're the one that's on the cutting edge. But if you head out to your local store, go to your local Walmart, and just stop people and ask them what they think about ChatGPT and AI and everything else, and what you'll realize is that you're living in a bubble that is really focused on this because it's important to you and your business, but the general population is not that up on it yet. So it's going to be slow. You're going to have time to make a transition, and that's where the practical part comes in, is embrace it. I think there's a sense of this might replace something that I do, therefore I'm not going to use it. I'm going to put my head in the sand and pretend it doesn't exist. And what I would encourage everyone to do is just go out there and use these new tools. Figure out how you can use them in your job every day to make your life easier, because if you don't, you're going to fall behind. If you're only manually writing your content one by one without the help of AI, if you're only making your videos one by one, you're going to fall behind, and you're going to be way less efficient than your competitors. So yeah, just embrace them, work them into your workflows in whatever way you're comfortable. And like what I always tell everybody at Ezoic is, like, turn yourself into a superhuman. Like, using these tools, you can get 3-5 times as much done by effectively using these tools than if you didn't. And if you just pretend that they don't exist, that you're not doing yourself any favors. So.
And if nothing else, you can just, when you said superhuman, I was like, oh yeah, you could just generate a picture of yourself as a superhero, hang it on your wall, and feel a lot better about it.
Exactly, every morning.
Yeah. I've seen some pretty good ones out there. That the image stuff has gotten so much better too, by the way, right? Yeah, it's incredible. But Dwayne, I want to thank you again for joining us. It's nice to trap you in a room and get your thoughts on all these things. I'd bug you all the time about them, but I know that this is probably questions that you get all the time from various folks. And so I know that they're topics that you go over quite a bit, but it's a fascinating time and it's interesting to get your thoughts on all of it. While I've got you on camera, I'm going to say, you're always welcome on the show. Can we have you on again?
Yeah, sure.
I figured I'd get it on tape. Maybe for 2024, 2025.
There we go.
Or we'll have an AI Dwayne by then.
But yeah, it's a very exciting time. I'm excited about it, more than scared. I think it's really cool. Publishing, there's always been change, but this is kind of the big revolution or change moment that's happening right now, this year, next year. So I think it's fun. There's going to be lots of opportunities. Yeah,
I agree. I would say my sentiment on it has definitely shifted and from more anxiety to excitement throughout the year. And I think that's probably our audience as well. And for all of you listening, we want to thank you for listening in 2023 to the Publisher Lab. We've almost been back a full year now. And if you want to catch up on any of the previous episodes, you can go to thepublisherlab.org and you can leave us a comment or ask us a question. We love those. We use them to make the show better. We like to practice what we preach. So if you have an opportunity to go on there and you have just a question or any kind of feedback, leave it there. And pretty much the next week, producer Manny here has rolled that in, whether that's from the decor in the background to the types of things that we talk about. So I want to thank Dwayne again for joining us, and we'll catch you next time on the Publisher Lab.
Thanks.